Welcome to a true spiritual adventure story like the world has never known with your host, Dr. James Yogadi Weldon.
Good day, this is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking to you from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina. Our community here, which is dedicated to bridging the gap in our understanding between the different traditions, spiritual traditions, scientific traditions, knowledge traditions, wisdom traditions of the world, and talking about the progression of the different states of consciousness. This is an ongoing discussion, a sharing from my third adventure novel, quite surprising, entitled The Story Behind the Greatest Story Ever Told, and subtitle, Memories from the Life of Jesus. And how all of this came about is difficult to tell in a few words. Basically, we can say that many years back, in a heightened state of consciousness, superconsciousness, in a place called Turiya, between waking and dreaming and sleeping, totally beyond my control, I begin to see and experience episodes and events from the life of Jesus. And after a few days, I thought I should start writing these things down. And it continued up to a certain point and then ended. And I wondered, what the heck am I going to do about this? Do with this? So many years later, the story picked up. And my teacher, one of the greatest humanitarians in the world, now with tens of millions of individuals who have benefited from his programs, began to share and tell me the synopsis of this story, perhaps to clarify and to encourage me to continue. So at this point in the story, the adventure novel, the young child has completed his education. The three wise men, many years back, told his parents to send this child to India, provided means to do so, told him where to go. And all of that has taken place. He has been educated in India. He's traveled and done a pilgrimage to some of the holiest places in India. It's not India at that time. It's a series of princely states. And after more than 20 years of being in India, he has now made his way back to his home. And so now begins the story that many individuals have read about, compiled in the Bible, that only represented a very short period of his life. And I would like to propose to you, just like in your own life, if someone only told you what happened in the last year or so, would they know you? Would they know your life? Would they know the full story? They would not. He did have a mission, and he came into this life to fulfill that mission, not to create a worldwide movement that later became known as Christianity, but to provide some relief to the tremendous suffering that was going on in the world. There's the work that we do in our job, in our business. And there's another work that we do in terms of growing and developing the inner state of our life. Many and most people in this world have no idea that that even exists, that there are stages of consciousness that progress in evolution, and that we're evolving as a physical being, as a spiritual being, over a long period of time. And the effect of the development of that higher state of living in the spirit, experiencing the kingdom of heaven within us, knowing that the Father and mother and the creator of this universe is one with us, and experiencing that not as a philosophy, not as a concept, not as a belief, but as a direct personal experience is really the deeper work that we all are doing in this world. And to not undertake that work and not to progress in that area is really to have wasted our time and energy on superficial things. And so this was the real work that he was doing. And as part of the Jewish culture, part of his work was to provide a raising of the state of life of those people in that region in the country, and to help bring grace, joy, love, and really energy into the collective consciousness, if you will. We are connected to our family. We all know that. If something happens in our family, it affects us. Genetically, we're very closely connected. Energetically, we're connected, even though we may deny it from time to time. What happens in our community and our family affects us. And in the same way, all these years that he had spent in training and teaching and studying the ancient traditions in that part of the world, in particular, his deep interest in the teachings of Buddha, which fit most closely with his characteristic, his inclination. And the reason for that is, of course, as I shared in some of the earlier episodes, he had been around during those earlier times when Buddha was present in the world and had studied in that community, both for a number of years in his present life, but in the past as well. And so after many, many years of traveling on the dusty trail, walking and climbing mountains, overcoming obstacles, physical obstacles in terms of accidents and trauma that happened to him, mental obstacles in terms of facing his worst fears, life and death, which we all ultimately need to do. He had matured into a being which was able to hold the presence of this divine life, was able to hold himself as a beacon of that insight. In a certain sense, the vehicle, physical vehicle, the mental vehicle, the emotional vehicle, the spiritual vehicle has been prepared. And now he was entering into a time where the force of that life could manifest through him and with him to affect that culture, not by creating a religion, which is ultimately what happened, but by helping the culture that he was connected with rise in its awareness from the desperation, the deep desperation and despair, which had been fermented for generations by the casting out of the Jewish community, which traveled all over that region, not only where he was born, but also he began to discover was in other areas of the world, particularly that region that I talked about a little bit earlier, Kashmir. And he saw that as actually the promised land ultimately. Arriving home and meeting in his family again after so many years, they had also grown. They had grown from his growth. And so arriving home, his family now had families of their own. Remember that people lived a much shorter life at that time in that part of the world. It's going to turn out that Jesus is going to live a much longer life than is typical in his culture. And so after so many years arriving home, after traveling the dusty trails, walking and riding camels over the desert, all the way from northern India in the Kashmir region, he picked up a caravan, traveled with them. After that long, long trip, he arrives at home. And his family and his parents can't believe that he's there. In a sense, they felt that connection. I talked in some of the earlier episodes and how his parents, from time to time, rarely, but from time to time, also would slip into this state and feel the connectedness. So messages of safety and security were passed on. And even when he had some trauma and he hurt himself very dangerously, they were also going through trials and tribulations, their own individual, but also some health challenges were happening also. And so to great jubilation, he arrived and gathered around his family, hugged them all. They cried tears of joy, of astonishment at how he had grown and what a presence he was manifesting. You see, the presence, the life, the vitality that we live says so much more than the words. And really, honestly, there was no way that he could begin to convey what had happened to him. And he could tell stories of how he shared some of the history of the Jewish people everywhere he went throughout India, but also how he was able to live and be so close to some of these very, very high beings in both the southern portion and also the northern portion of India, and actually traveling along the way, meeting individuals who had lived a very, very, very long time and were still healthy and vital in that part of the world, and what that society was like. You see, the entire culture, really, of the world, but every particular ethnic group has a vision and a dream of a heavenly place on this earth. I'm living in one of those right now. He traveled to a number of different locations in that time that I really haven't talked about. Otherwise, this would be much, much longer. One of those interesting places is actually the Valley of the Saints in India, en route, known as Rishikesh, which was founded by a seer, a rishi. Yeah, that locality went all the way back to the ancient days of the story of Rama. That's a whole story, obviously, that I'm not here to share. After that historical epic was over, Rama actually traveled to the north as well as part of a cosmic adventure, not just an earthly adventure, and actually a global adventure. The influence of those individuals was actually in the early ages. There were 7 major spiritual centers on the planet, both in North America and South America. So life is a cosmic adventure and continues. And he was continuing that adventure. He was driven by that need to make a contribution. It wasn't enough that he had come to experience and live and feel and imbibe and manifest that tremendous love that was transmitted down from teacher to student. That's always how it is. This state that we're talking about, even for somebody with such aptitude as Jesus, required many years of study and practice to fully manifest that. And so now, if you will, the rose of divine love had blossomed in his life. And he'd arrived home to do that portion of his work, to provide relief, not to become a king, not to become a leader, really not to start any kind of movement whatsoever, but to be a part of manifesting that spiritual presence. And I really say be a part. Because even if you look in what has come down to us in the Bible, Jesus says over and over again, I am a man like any man. And the Father and Mother who is in me. He talked more about the Father because obviously many of the people he was talking about in the entire culture was what we would call patriarchal, male dominated. And so this was his arrival. And he was ready for the task. He was prepared for the task. But a few things needed to happen first. A great light had begun to shine in that part of the world. In the same way we can be above the world and we look at the world at night, we see the lights of the communities now. And some are bright, some are dim. That's how it is in terms of the spiritual presence. That sometimes the earth is dark and sometimes the light comes in the world. So he was a light that came into the world to link up with a few others to provide some relief by the raising of the vibration in that part of the world, and to meet with some individuals that he did have a connection with in the past, who were also prepared. So his family was now prepared to undertake some of those difficult times by their growth, but also a few other individuals who were just living lives, didn't know that they were connected. They felt a rising of the consciousness. And one of those, the principal one of those, was John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was living a life in the desert, comparatively much like a recluse, living on the fringes. In modern times, we might call him a political and religious activist, hoping to inspire the community to live a more righteous and pure life, encouraging them to also come into an experience of their own spirituality. And symbolic of that was the immersion in the waters, which represents the immersion into the divine love and being all around us, really. But through periods of prayer and silent meditation, immersion into the presence of the living light. And so the magnets of causality were drawing these individuals together for the moment when the anointing of the Spirit could take place. The events that needed to transpire for the relief of the heavy weight. If you've had a chance to listen to the earlier episodes from this story, particularly the early ones, there's an episode, surprising, which talks about his earlier preparation. And he was told even in that time by his teacher there would be a time like this that was coming. The pull of those events to help this wonderful drama unfold of grace and love, of inspiration, and relief, so that the despair that had overtaken his community could be lifted. That was the real work. The stories that were told later and what became of his life was not really what was happening. And so in our next episode, we'll talk about it. So join us again next time, and we'll talk more about that. So this is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking to you from a mountain where the descent of that heavenly force and love is happening now in our time. History repeats itself, not with the same specific events, but the pattern is very similar. So we're in a time of tremendous growth and breakthrough in the world, where the grace and love that he manifested, that he brought and lived, is happening. We'll talk more about this later.